June 28, 1944. 240 feet beneath the surface of Mount Tapotchau. Captain Masashi Tanaka sat alone in Tunnel 7. His engineering journal open before him. A single candle casting flickering shadows against the volcanic stone. His hands were steady now. They had stopped trembling 2 weeks earlier, when hope had died and only duty remained. Above him, the island of Saipan was burning. 13 days of American bombardment had reduced 3/4 of the Japanese garrison to ash and memory. The thunder of naval guns rolled across the island like endless earthquakes. The scream of artillery shells had become so constant that silence itself seemed foreign. Yet Tanaka remained focused on his calculations, working through equations that had become exercises in futility. He had designed 17 interconnected cave positions across the mountain's volcanic face, 3.2 kilometers of tunnels, 47 separate defensive chambers, a masterpiece of military engineering that should have held for months. The Americans had given him 13 days. What happened in those final hours would teach Tanaka a truth about modern warfare that no textbook had ever mentioned, a truth that came exactly 48 hours too late. He dipped his pen in ink and began writing what would become his final entry. Outside, somewhere in the darkness above, American Marines were approaching with weapons that would turn his fortress into a crematorium. The mathematics of his defeat were about to become horrifyingly clear. Captain Masashi Tanaka had arrived on Saipan in March 1944 with orders that seemed straightforward. Make the mountain a fortress. He was 34 years old, a graduate of Tokyo Imperial University's engineering program, commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1936. He had overseen fortification projects in Burma and Manchuria, earning promotion to captain through competence rather than connections. General Yoshitsugu Saito, commander of the Saipan garrison, had summoned Tanaka to his headquarters on the 3rd day after his arrival. The general was a cavalry officer by training, a man who understood horses and maneuver warfare, who had fought in China and earned decorations for personal bravery. Saito spread a map across his desk and pointed to Mount Tapotchau, the highest point on the island, rising 1,500 feet above the surrounding terrain. The Americans will come from the south, Saito explained. They will land on the beaches, establish their supply lines, then advance toward the mountain. Every meter of elevation will cost them blood. Every cave will cost them time. Your job is to make that cost unbearable. Tanaka studied the map with the analytical eye of an engineer. The volcanic geology of Saipan was ideal for defensive construction. The stone was soft enough to excavate, but hard enough to resist bombardment. Natural caves already existed throughout the mountain. They could be expanded, connected, reinforced. How long do you need the mountain to hold? Tanaka asked. Saito smiled without humor. Forever would be preferable. But the Navy assures me that relief forces will arrive within 60 days of any American landing. Hold for 2 months, Captain. That is all I ask. Tanaka accepted the assignment with confidence. He had studied American amphibious operations across the Pacific. They were methodical, predictable, relentless. The Americans would land, establish beachheads, bring up artillery, and grind forward through conventional assault. He understood how to defeat that approach. What he did not understand, what no one in the Japanese military understood, was that the Americans had been learning too. and they had developed weapons specifically designed to defeat fortifications like the one Tanaka was about to build. From March through June 1944, Tanaka commanded 400 combat engineers in the most ambitious fortification project of the Pacific War. They worked in shifts around the clock, excavating volcanic stone with picks and shovels, reinforcing tunnel walls with timber and concrete, installing ventilation systems and drainage channels, laying communication wires and ammunition storage chambers. The design was elegant in its complexity. 47 separate cave positions, each capable of independent defense, 3.2 kilometers of tunnels linking the major positions, multiple levels descending from the surface to depths of 400 feet. Each level connected to the levels above and below by narrow passages that could be defended by a single machine gun. The principle was redundancy at every stage. The Americans could destroy one cave, 10 others remained operational. They could collapse a tunnel. Alternate routes existed. They could advance to a secondary position. Tertiary positions waited behind it. Quaternary retreats behind those. Tanaka calculated that a determined garrison could hold the mountain for months, bleeding the Americans white with every advance, trading space for time, waiting for the relief forces that would never come. Private First Class Kenji Yamamoto was one of the laborers who built Tanaka's fortress. He was 19 years old, drafted from his family's farm in Niigata Prefecture, trained for 3 months, and shipped to Saipan to dig tunnels. "We worked until our hands bled," Yamamoto remembered in a letter to his parents that was never sent. Captain Tanaka inspected every tunnel personally. He measured angles with instruments I didn't understand. He insisted that ventilation shafts be positioned exactly as he specified. We thought he was obsessed with perfection. We didn't understand that he was trying to keep us alive. The caves were designed not just for defense, but for survival. Storage chambers held rice, water, and ammunition. Medical stations were positioned at key junctions. Command posts were buried so deep that no bomb could reach them. By June 1st, Tanaka reported to General Saito that the mountain was ready. 47 caves, 3.2 kilometers of tunnels, supplies for 60 days. The Americans would break themselves against volcanic stone. Saito was pleased. He commended Tanaka for his engineering skill and promoted him to Chief of Defensive Fortifications for the entire northern sector. 2 weeks later, the Americans arrived with weapons that would make Tanaka's masterpiece into a mass grave. June 15, 1944. The American invasion of Saipan began at dawn. 8 battleships, 11 cruisers, 26 destroyers, hundreds of landing craft, the largest amphibious assault in Pacific War history up to that date. Japanese intelligence had predicted 50,000 American troops, perhaps as many as 100,000 in the worst case. The actual number was 130,000 soldiers and sailors converging on a single island. The 2nd Marine Division, the 4th Marine Division, the 27th Army Division, naval personnel, construction battalions, support troops. The bombardment that preceded the landing was beyond anything the Japanese defenders had experienced. Private Hiroshi Nakamura manned an observation post on the southern coast of Saipan. He had been watching the horizon since before dawn, waiting for the American fleet that intelligence had warned was coming. When the ships appeared, he could not count them. The horizon was filled with vessels, more ships than he had ever seen in his life, more ships than he had imagined existed. Then the guns opened fire. The world ended, Nakamura wrote in his diary. The beach exploded. The palm trees exploded. The bunkers exploded. Men I had eaten breakfast with exploded. I pressed myself into the earth and prayed to every god I knew. The shells kept falling. For hours they kept falling. The American Marines hit the beaches at 8:40 a.m. They faced fierce resistance. Japanese defenders in fortified positions poured machine gun fire into the landing craft. Mortars and artillery targeted the beach exits. The assault wave suffered heavy casualties, but the Marines kept coming, and they kept coming, and they kept coming. By nightfall on June 15th, 20,000 American soldiers were ashore on Saipan. The beachhead was 4 miles wide and half a mile deep. Japanese counterattacks had failed to push them back into the sea. General Sato received the reports in his command cave with growing alarm. The scale of the American assault exceeded every estimate. The naval bombardment had destroyed coastal defenses that were supposed to hold for days. The Japanese Navy, which was supposed to contest the landing, was nowhere to be seen. He sent a message to Tanaka, "Prepare the mountain defenses. The Americans will reach you sooner than expected." 200 miles west of Saipan, the Imperial Japanese Navy was sailing toward the greatest defeat in its history. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa commanded the mobile fleet, 9 aircraft carriers with over 500 planes, the largest concentration of Japanese naval aviation since Midway. His mission was to destroy the American fleet and relieve Saipan. On June 19th and 20th, the Battle of the Philippine Sea would determine the fate of the Pacific War. It was not close. American radar detected the Japanese aircraft at extreme range. American fighters, the new F-6F Hellcats, rose to intercept. The Japanese pilots, many of them inadequately trained replacements for veterans lost at Midway and in the Solomons, flew into a massacre. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days of fighting, Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers and over 400 aircraft. The pilots who died represented an irreplaceable resource. Japan could build new carriers. It could not train experienced pilots fast enough to replace the hundreds who fell into the Philippine Sea. The American fleet was barely scratched. 130 aircraft lost. No ships sunk. The relief of Saipan was now impossible. The convoys carrying food, ammunition, and reinforcements would never arrive. The garrison was trapped on an island that had become a tomb. When Tanaka received word of the naval disaster, he retreated to his engineering journal and began new calculations. Without resupply, how long could the garrison hold? He factored in the remaining rice stocks, the water available from mountain springs, the ammunition in storage chambers, the rate of American advance, the attrition from combat and disease. The answer was 17 days. The American assault was already 6 days old. 11 days remained before complete collapse. Tanaka told no one. The number was too terrible to speak out loud. By June 24th, the Japanese garrison was dying from within. The tropical climate of Saipan bred diseases that killed as efficiently as American bullets. Malaria swept through units that had no quinine to treat it. Dysentery spread through water supplies contaminated by the bombardment. Dengue fever left men too weak to stand. Tanaka's command received 1/10 of the promised food rations. Men who should have been eating 3 meals a day were surviving on a handful of rice and whatever they could scavenge from the jungle. Private Taro Ishikawa was 20 years old, a machine gunner assigned to Cave 12 in Tanaka's defensive network. He had weighed 140 pounds when he arrived on Saipan. By late June, he weighed less than 100. "We were ghosts before the Americans killed us," he wrote in a letter found after the battle. "Ghosts with rifles, ghosts waiting to become ancestors. The hunger was worse than fear. Fear you can push away. Hunger stays with you every moment." The medical supplies were exhausted. Bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. Antibiotics were gone. Surgical instruments were sterilized with fire because alcohol was needed for other purposes. Wounded men died from infections that could have been treated with basic supplies. Men with survivable injuries became corpses because the garrison lacked the resources to save them. Yet the defensive works continued. Tanaka drove his remaining engineers forward with mechanical focus. They dug deeper. They widened tunnels. They created additional positions. The defensive system grew more complex even as the soldiers defending it grew weaker. It was a paradox that Tanaka recognized but could not resolve. The more elaborate the defense became, the more dependent it was on soldiers maintaining combat capability. But combat capability was collapsing. Malaria had infected 45% of the garrison. Dysentery had incapacitated another 20%. Men were dying from preventable diseases at a rate that exceeded combat casualties. Tanaka calculated the mathematics every night in his journal. Each tunnel required 12 to 15 healthy soldiers to defend effectively. He had begun construction on 16 major cave systems. Defending all 16 would require 240 combat-capable men at minimum. His actual force of healthy soldiers was declining toward 150. Within 48 hours, he would have insufficient personnel to man even half of his defensive positions. The fortress he had built was becoming too large for the army that remained to defend it.
June 28, 1944, the afternoon that transformed Tanaka's understanding of warfare. The first report came from Tunnel 3 at 1400 hours. Lieutenant Kenji Yoshida, commanding the position, transmitted a message that made no sense. Americans using new weapon. Not artillery, not grenades, liquid fire, burns everything. Tanaka's initial reaction was skepticism. Liquid fire? It sounded like propaganda, like the fantastic weapon rumors that circulated constantly through the garrison. The Americans possessed secret wraiths, invisible tanks, weapons that defied physics. Tanaka was a scientist by training. He dismissed such talk as fatigue and fear, manifesting as fantasy. But more reports followed. Tunnel 5 at 1430 hours. Flamethrower teams approaching, cannot hold entrance. Tunnel 2 at 1445 hours. Fire weapons deployed, interior becoming unbearable. Tunnel 11 at 1500 hours. Burning liquid flowing into secondary positions, men retreating deeper. 7 separate reports over 90 minutes. 7 positions scattered across hundreds of meters of mountainside, all describing the same weapon. Tanaka ordered his adjutant to bring a sample of burned rock from Tunnel 4, where the flamethrower attack had been most intense. The stone arrived 30 minutes later, carried by a runner who had navigated the connecting tunnels at considerable personal risk. Tanaka examined it under candlelight with the focused attention of an engineer confronting an engineering problem. His skepticism evaporated completely. The volcanic limestone had liquefied at the surface. The internal structure remained intact, but the outer layer had fused into a glass-like slag. The color indicated temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius. No conventional weapon produced this effect. This was sustained burning. Chemical combustion engineered specifically for maximum thermal output directed at a single point. Tanaka understood the implications immediately, and they were catastrophic. The strength of Tanaka's cave system was concealment and depth. The Americans could not see defenders positioned in darkness.
Artillery shells penetrated cave entrances, but lost their effectiveness as the tunnels curved and descended. The depth of the mountain absorbed blast effects that would have been lethal in open terrain. Conventional weapons were frustrated by redundancy and layering. Each position led to another position. Each level connected to deeper levels. The Americans would have to fight their way through every chamber, every tunnel, every defensive line. But flamethrowers created a problem that Tanaka's engineering training had never anticipated. Fire did not care about depth. Fire was a fluid. Fire sought oxygen. Fire flowed into chambers and tunnels like water flowing downhill. Fire accumulated in enclosed spaces where men waited in what they thought was safety. Each additional tunnel depth increased the surface area exposed to thermal destruction. The caves became chimneys, drawing superheated air deeper into the mountain. The ventilation systems Tanaka had designed so carefully now became conduits for death. He began calculating the implications with the precision of a mathematician confronting an equation that had no solution. If the Americans possessed flamethrowers in sufficient numbers, his entire defense strategy was not just weakened, it was inverted. The caves became traps rather than fortresses. Each tunnel was now a funnel directing heat deeper into the mountain. The secondary positions became death chambers. The layered defense, designed to trade space for time, was transformed into a system that amplified the effect of a single weapon. Tanaka had built 47 separate cave positions. Each position was an extension of the same defensive principle. Depth equals survival. Layering equals resilience. Flamethrowers eliminated both principles. A single flamethrower team at a cave entrance could make the entire 400 feet of depth behind it uninhabitable. Men would not be killed by bullets. They would be killed by heat and smoke and the absence of breathable air. The mathematical conclusion was inescapable. The defense system that Tanaka had designed over 4 months was being made obsolete by a weapon that the Americans had deployed over 4 days. On the American side of the battle, the flamethrower operators knew exactly what they were doing. Private First Class Vincent Garofalo was 22 years old, a Marine from South Philadelphia, assigned to a flamethrower team attached to the 4th Marine Division. He had volunteered for the assignment because it came with extra pay, not understanding until training what the job actually required. The M22 flamethrower weighed 70 pounds when fully loaded. It carried 4 gallons of thickened fuel, a mixture of gasoline and a gelling agent that made the burning liquid stick to whatever it touched. The effective range was 40 yards. The fuel supply lasted approximately 7 seconds of continuous fire. 7 seconds. That was all Garofalo had to work with before he needed to reload or retreat. They told us the Japs were dug in deep, caves and tunnels everywhere. Regular weapons couldn't reach them. That's where we came in. We were supposed to burn them out. The flamethrower operators faced dangers that regular infantry did not. The fuel tanks on their backs were explosive. A single bullet in the wrong place would turn the operator into a human torch. Japanese defenders who spotted flamethrower teams concentrated their fire on them, knowing that killing the operator was worth more than killing 10 regular riflemen. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in Pacific combat was measured in minutes once the shooting started. Garofalo's first cave assault came on June 27th. His team approached a position on the lower slopes of Mount Tapotchau that had been suppressing Marine advances for 2 days. Machine gun fire from the cave entrance had killed 11 men. Artillery strikes had done nothing. We crawled up through the undergrowth. 200 yards took an hour. The whole time that machine gun was firing at anybody who moved. I could feel bullets going over my head. I knew if they spotted me with the tanks on my back, I was dead.
He reached a position 15 yards from the cave entrance. His team provided covering fire. He stood, aimed the nozzle, and pulled the trigger. The fire went in like water from a hose, except it was burning. I could see it splash against the walls inside. Stick to the rock. Keep burning. I heard screaming. Men screaming. Then the screaming stopped. Garofalo fired 2 more bursts. Then he retreated to reload while the cave filled with smoke. When the Marines entered the position an hour later, they found 17 Japanese bodies. Some had been burned directly. Others had suffocated as the fire consumed all the oxygen in the enclosed space. A few had shot themselves rather than burned to death. Garofalo did not sleep that night. I kept hearing the screaming, he admitted. For years after the war, I heard it. You don't forget that sound. You can tell yourself they were the enemy. They would have killed you. It was war. All that's true, but you don't forget. At 18:30 hours on June 28th, Captain Tanaka was summoned to General Saito's command cave for an emergency meeting. Saito sat behind a field desk that had been carved from volcanic rock. He looked older than his 54 years. The stress of the battle had hollowed his cheeks and grayed his hair. He had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the invasion began. Tanaka presented his analysis with the precision of an engineer delivering a technical report. He showed Saito the sample of fused rock from Tunnel 4. He described the 7 reports from separate positions. He calculated the thermal output required to produce glass-like slag from volcanic limestone. Then he explained what it meant. The caves could no longer be held as sequential fallback positions. The depth that was supposed to protect defenders now made them vulnerable. The tunnels that were supposed to provide escape routes now channeled fire deeper into the mountain. Tanaka recommended immediate changes to the defensive posture. The cave should be defended at the entrance only, with lighter garrisons, minimizing the number of men exposed to flamethrower attack. The interior of the mountain should be abandoned. The deeper position should be evacuated and used only for command and communications. Saito listened with the expression of a man receiving information he was not equipped to process. He was a cavalry officer. He understood horses and sabers and the shock of a mounted charge. He did not understand thermodynamics and chemical combustion. Does this mean surrendering the defensive advantage of depth? Saito asked. It means recognizing that depth is no longer an advantage. It is a liability that will result in mass casualties. The Americans have discovered a way to make the mountain itself into a weapon against us. Surrendering the interior now might save 400 lives. Fighting in those interior positions will waste them against a weapon that has no effective counter. Saito was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. The defense will continue as planned. Total resistance. Every position held until destroyed. Every man fights to the last. Those are the orders from Imperial General Headquarters. I do not have the authority to change them. Tanaka accepted the order without protest. He was a soldier. Officers did not question commands from their superiors. But he knew with mathematical certainty what would happen in the coming days. The Americans would advance. The flamethrower teams would approach. The thermal assault would begin. The defenders would die in enclosed spaces, their lungs burning from superheated air that they could not escape. He returned to Tunnel 7 and resumed his calculations. The question was no longer whether the caves would fall. The question was how long it would take for the Americans to burn through 3.2 kilometers of volcanic tunnels. The battle for Saipan was not only a military tragedy, it was a human catastrophe that extended far beyond the combatants. 25,000 Japanese civilians lived on Saipan when the invasion began. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, children, families who had emigrated from Japan to build new lives in the Pacific territories. Japanese military propaganda had told them terrible things about the Americans. The Marines were barbarians who tortured prisoners. American soldiers raped women and murdered children. Surrender meant fates worse than death. None of it was true. But the civilians believed it. As the American advance pushed the Japanese garrison towards the northern tip of the island, the civilians retreated with them. They crowded into caves alongside soldiers. They competed for the dwindling food and water.
They listened to the bombardment and wondered what would happen when the Americans finally came. On July 7th, as the Japanese garrison prepared for its final banzai charge, the civilian population faced its own terrible choice. At Marpi Point, the northernmost tip of Saipan, 800-foot cliffs dropped straight to the ocean below. Thousands of civilians gathered there as the battle reached its conclusion. American Marines approaching the cliffs witnessed something that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Families walked to the edge of the cliff and jumped. Mothers threw their children over the edge before following them down. Groups of civilians joined hands and stepped into the void together. Some were pushed by Japanese soldiers. Others went willingly, believing that death was preferable to American captivity. Private First Class Harold Johnston was 19 years old, a Marine from Kansas who had never seen the ocean before enlisting. He reached Marpi Point on July 9th. "I watched a woman throw her baby off the cliff," Johnston said decades later, his voice still breaking at the memory. "Then she jumped after it. I was screaming at her to stop. We were trying to tell them we wouldn't hurt them. They didn't understand, or they didn't believe us. They just kept jumping." The Marines tried everything to stop the suicides. They broadcast surrender appeals in Japanese. They sent interpreters forward to promise good treatment. They threw food and water to civilians trapped on the rocks below the cliffs. Some civilians accepted the American offers. Many did not. Estimates of civilian deaths at Marpi Point and elsewhere on Saipan range from 8,000 to 20,000. The exact number will never be known. Many bodies were never recovered. The propaganda that caused this tragedy was a Japanese creation, but the young Marines who witnessed it carried the trauma forever.
July 6, 1944. General Saito issued his final order. The remaining 4,000 able-bodied soldiers would launch a Gyokusai, a final banzai charge against American positions. The word meant shattered jewel, the honorable death of a warrior rather than the disgrace of surrender. Saito's message to his troops was poetic in the Japanese tradition of death poetry. Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death. However, in death there is life. We must utilize this opportunity to exalt true Japanese manhood. I will advance with you to deliver still another blow to the American devils and leave my bones on Saipan as a fortress of the Pacific. The order reached Tanaka in Tunnel 7 at 1800 hours. He read it twice, then closed his engineering journal for the final time. His last entry contained a single paragraph that revealed what he had learned through the destruction of his fortress. The Japanese Empire is not losing this war because its soldiers lack courage. Every man in my command has proven willing to die for his country. We are losing because the enemy has built systems that make individual courage irrelevant. The Americans have systems for feeding troops, for treating malaria, for delivering ammunition, for coordinating artillery and air support, for evacuating wounded, for replacing losses. Japan has slogans about fighting spirit. That difference is not a matter of national character or military virtue. It is a matter of industrial capacity and logistics. Tanaka spent the night of July 6th preparing his engineers for the charge. He distributed the remaining ammunition. He destroyed documents that might provide intelligence to the enemy. He wrote letters to families that would never be sent. At 04:30 hours on July 7th, the survivors of the Japanese garrison emerged from the caves and tunnels that Tanaka had spent 4 months designing. They formed into assault groups. Some carried rifles with fixed bayonets. Others carried swords. A few carried only sharpened bamboo poles. Many were wounded. Many were sick. Many could barely walk. They charged toward the American lines. The American forces had prepared for the attack. Intelligence had intercepted Japanese radio communications, indicating that a final assault was imminent. General Holland Smith, commanding the Mauritians on Saipan, had ordered his units to establish defensive positions in depth. The 27th Army Division held the line across the Tanapag Plain, the flat ground north of Garapan, where the Japanese charge would emerge from the hills. Artillery was pre-registered on likely avenues of approach. Machine gun positions were sandbagged and reinforced. Mortars were zeroed on the open ground. At 04:45 hours, the first Japanese soldiers appeared in the morning twilight. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien commanded the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment. His position was directly in the path of the main Japanese thrust. He had placed his men in foxholes along a low ridge overlooking the plain. We heard them before we saw them, screaming, thousands of voices screaming. Then they came out of the brush, wave after wave, more men than I had ever seen attacking at once. The American machine guns opened fire. The Japanese kept coming. Artillery rounds fell among the charging soldiers, blowing gaps in the formation. The Japanese closed the gaps and kept coming. Mortar shells burst overhead, scattering fragments across the assault waves. The Japanese stepped over their dead and kept coming. Riflemen emptied their magazines, reloaded, emptied them again.
The Japanese were 30 yards away, 20 yards, 10 yards. The line broke. Japanese soldiers overran the forward American positions, killing with bayonets and swords. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted across the battlefield. Men grappled in the darkness, stabbing and choking and beating each other to death. Colonel O'Brien was wounded in the initial assault. He refused evacuation. He manned a machine gun position himself, firing until the gun jammed, then picking up a rifle, then a pistol. He was last seen standing in the open, firing his pistol at Japanese soldiers charging toward him from 3 directions. His body was found the next day surrounded by 30 enemy dead. O'Brien was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The fighting continued for 15 hours. The Japanese charged in waves until there were no more waves to send. American artillery fired until barrels overheated. Machine gunners fired until their weapons jammed from continuous use. By nightfall, on July 7th, nearly 5,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. The Tanaka Plain was carpeted with bodies. In some places, the dead lay 3 deep. American casualties totaled over 400 killed and wounded. It was the costliest single day for American forces in the Mariana Islands campaign. Captain Tanaka did not survive the Banzai charge. He was killed by artillery fire at approximately 0600 hours on July 7th, while attempting to maintain discipline among his engineers in the chaos of the assault. Witnesses reported that his final words concerned not honor or the emperor, but the realization that all his engineering, all his calculations, all his months of work had been reduced to dust and fire.
His body was never recovered. General Saito chose a different end. On the evening of July 6th, before the charge began, Saito retreated to a cave near the village of Makunsha. He was too ill to lead the assault personally. Diabetes and exhaustion had left him barely able to walk. At dawn on July 7th, as his soldiers charged to their deaths, Saito knelt on a white sheet in the cave entrance, facing the direction of the imperial palace in Tokyo. He drew his sword and prepared to commit seppuku, the ritual suicide of a samurai who had failed his lord. His adjutant, Lieutenant Hirakushi, stood behind him with a pistol. Saito plunged the blade into his abdomen and drew it across his belly. Before the agony could become unbearable, Hirakushi fired a single shot into the back of his head. General Yoshitsugu Saito was dead. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo died the same morning. Nagumo had commanded the carrier fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. He had led Japanese naval aviation at the height of its power when 6 aircraft carriers had roamed the Pacific virtually unchallenged. Now he was a shore commander on a doomed island, his fleet destroyed, his sailors fighting as infantry. His career ended in disgrace. Nagumo shot himself in his command bunker rather than face capture. 2 of Japan's most senior commanders died within hours of each other, one by ritual suicide, one by a bullet to his own head. Their deaths symbolized the collapse of Japanese power in the Pacific.
Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith commanded all Marine forces in the Marianas Campaign. He was 62 years old, a veteran of 38 years in the Corps, known to his men as Howling Mad for his explosive temper and aggressive tactics. Smith was not beloved by everyone. His relief of Army Major General Ralph Smith, commanding the 27th Infantry Division, had created a controversy that echoed through military and political circles for months afterward. Holland Smith believed the 27th Division had advanced too slowly, endangering the Marines on its flanks. He had relieved Ralph Smith on June 24th, the first time a Marine general had relieved an Army general in combat. The Army never forgave him. The Smith versus Smith controversy became a symbol of inter-service rivalry that persisted long after the war ended. But Holland Smith understood something about the Pacific War that many of his critics missed. Speed was essential. Every day the battle continued, more Americans died. Every week of delay gave the Japanese time to fortify the next island. The enemy fought to the death regardless of tactical situation, which meant that careful, methodical advances produced the same Japanese casualties as aggressive assaults, while costing more American lives through extended exposure to combat. After the battle ended, Holland Smith did something unusual for a victor. He ordered a formal military funeral for General Saito. The ceremony took place on July 10th at the American Military Cemetery on Saipan. Saito's body had been recovered from the cave where he died and was treated with the respect due a fallen general officer. American soldiers served as pallbearers. An honor guard fired a salute. A bugler played taps. Smith's enemies called it inappropriate, honoring an enemy commander whose soldiers had massacred wounded during the Banzai Charge. Smith did not care. He was a soldier, Smith said. He did his duty as he understood it. That deserves respect. Saipan was not just another island in the Pacific. Its capture changed the course of the war. The Mariana Islands, of which Saipan was the northernmost, lay 1,400 miles from Tokyo. That distance was significant for one reason. It was within range of the B-29 Super Fortress, the new American heavy bomber that was designed to carry the war to the Japanese home islands. Before Saipan, American bombers could not reach Japan. After Saipan, they could. Construction of airfields began within days of the island's capture. By November 1944, B-29s were flying missions against Japanese cities.
By March 1945, incendiary raids were devastating Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. The strategic bombing campaign that Saipan made possible killed more Japanese civilians than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. General Hideki Tojo, the prime minister who had led Japan into war, understood what the fall of Saipan meant. When the island fell on July 9th, he told his cabinet that Japan has lost the war. He was forced to resign on July 18th, replaced by a government that immediately began secret discussions about how the war might be ended. The discussions went nowhere. The military refused to accept any terms that involved surrender. The emperor remained silent. The war continued for another 13 months. But Tojo was right. Japan had lost the war. The fall of Saipan made that loss inevitable. The island was not just a military objective. It was the key that unlocked Japan's defenses and made the home islands vulnerable to attack for the first time. 29,000 Japanese soldiers died defending Saipan. Nearly 3,000 Americans died taking it. 20,000 or more Japanese civilians died in the battle and its aftermath. All of those deaths led to a single strategic result: American bombers within range of Tokyo.
Captain Tanaka's engineering journal was recovered from the ruins of Tunnel 7 in August 1944. American intelligence officers translated it and circulated copies through the military hierarchy. The document became one of the most studied first-hand accounts of Japanese defensive tactics produced during the war. But it was Tanaka's final observation that attracted the most attention. His analysis of why Japan was losing the war, written hours before his death, identified a truth that military historians have cited ever since. Japan was not losing because its soldiers lacked courage. Every battle in the Pacific had proven Japanese willingness to die for their country. The courage was real. The sacrifice was genuine. The fighting spirit was everything that Japanese propaganda claimed it to be. Japan was losing because courage was not enough. The Americans had systems. They had logistics that delivered food, water, and ammunition to frontline troops under fire. They had medical evacuation that saved wounded soldiers who would have died under Japanese field conditions. They had replacement programs that fed fresh troops into divisions depleted by combat. They had industrial production that provided more tanks, more planes, more ships, more of everything than Japan could match. Japan had slogans: fighting spirit, death before dishonor, 100 million hearts beating as one. The slogans could not feed troops in the jungle. They could not treat malaria. They could not replace destroyed aircraft. They could not match American industrial output. Tanaka understood this with the clarity of an engineer who had watched his fortress become a tomb. The caves he had designed were marvels of military engineering. They should have held for months. They fell in days because the system supporting them collapsed, while the American system ground forward with relentless efficiency. The flamethrowers were just the final proof. A weapon that any competent engineer could have designed defeated fortifications that had required 4 months of labor. The Americans had the industrial capacity to manufacture thousands of flamethrowers, to train operators, to deploy the weapon across multiple divisions simultaneously. Japan could not match that capacity. Japan could not develop countermeasures fast enough. Japan could only watch as one defensive position after another was burned into silence. The fall of Saipan established a pattern that would repeat across the Pacific for the remainder of the war. Guam fell on August 10, 1944. The same flamethrower tactics that had burned through Mount Tapotchau burned through the caves of Guam. Tinian fell on August 1, 1944. The island that would later serve as the launch point for the atomic bomb missions was captured using the same techniques pioneered on Saipan. Peleliu fell in November 1944. The same pattern:
Caves that were supposed to hold for months burned out in weeks by flamethrower teams that had perfected their tactics through repetition. Iwo Jima fell in March 1945, the most heavily fortified island in the Pacific, defended by 21,000 Japanese soldiers in a cave network that made Saipan look primitive. The flamethrowers burned through it in 5 weeks. Okinawa fell in June 1945, the last major battle before the planned invasion of Japan. The caves, the tunnels, the flamethrowers, the same pattern, the same result. Every battle followed the template that Tanaka had identified in his final days. Japanese defensive positions that should have been impregnable fell because the system supporting them could not compete with American logistics and industrial capacity. Japanese soldiers who were willing to die could not overcome American soldiers who were willing to fight and had the material support to sustain that fight indefinitely. The courage was equal on both sides. The systems were not. By August 1945, when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers in defensive battles that all ended the same way. The caves were burned, the garrisons were destroyed, the islands were captured. The empire that had conquered half the Pacific in 6 months was pushed back to its home islands in 18 months of relentless American advance. Captain Masashi Tanaka died on July 7, 1944, killed by artillery fire during a charge that he knew was futile. He was 34 years old. He had designed a fortress that should have held for months. He had watched that fortress become a crematorium for the men who trusted his engineering. He had written the truth about why Japan was losing the war, knowing that the truth could not save his country. His diary survived because an American intelligence officer recognized its value. His words have been studied by military historians for 80 years. His analysis of the relationship between systems and courage remains relevant today. The mountain fortress he built still exists in fragments. You can visit the caves of Saipan, the tunnels that Tanaka designed, the chambers where Japanese soldiers waited for death. The scorch marks from American flamethrowers are still visible on some walls, permanent testimony to the weapon that made depth into a liability. General Saito died by his own sword, following a code of honor that demanded death rather than surrender. Admiral Nagumo died by his own hand, the architect of Pearl Harbor ending his career in a bunker on a lost island. 4,000 soldiers died in a charge that everyone knew was hopeless, and 20,000 civilians died because propaganda had convinced them that death was preferable to American mercy. The battle for Saipan lasted 25 days. It cost 32,000 Japanese lives, military and civilian combined. It cost 3,000 American lives. It opened the door to the bombing campaign that would devastate Japan's cities and kill hundreds of thousands more. One island, one battle, one turning point that made the end of the war inevitable. The lessons that Tanaka identified in his final diary entry remain true. Wars are not won by courage alone, though courage is essential. Wars are won by systems, by logistics, by industrial capacity, by the ability to sustain operations when the enemy cannot. Japan had courage. Japan had fighting spirit. Japan had soldiers willing to die by the thousands for their emperor. America had systems. The side with better systems will defeat the side with better slogans, every time. That is the truth that Captain Masashi Tanaka learned in the caves of Mount Tapotchau. That is the lesson that cost Japan its empire. And that is why, 80 years later, military academies still study the battle for Saipan, the mountain that became a tomb, and the engineer who understood too late why his fortress could not stand.